Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to welcome you to the listening session for the proposed violation scoring procedure revisions. My name is Asha Sethi, and I'm a public participation specialist for the California Department of Toxic Substances Control. I'll be facilitating the public input portion of this meeting and encourage you to provide us with feedback. We do hope to hear from as many of you as we can today. You can also submit comments to us through the close of the comment period, which goes through October 29th. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on our website. The purpose of this webinar is to discuss sections of the violation scoring procedure regulations that may need revisions and receive input from interested stakeholders regarding the revisions and clarifications. In the chat, you'll find links to information about SB 673 permit criteria for community protection on our website. Next, I'll go over the agenda for this meeting. First, we have opening remarks from Rizgar Ghazi, who's the Deputy Director for the Hazardous Waste Management Program. And next, we have a presentation that provides an overview of the violation scoring procedure from Ryan Mia, who's the Senior Scientist. And then we have a presentation about the revisions under consideration by Gary Hammond, who's a Senior Hazardous Substances Engineer. We'll have the remainder of the time to hear from you. And during the listening session, we'd like to hear from you and take note of your comments. We'd also like to provide the opportunity for you to ask questions and engage in dialogue with DTSC staff. All of your input will be taken into consideration in revising the violation scoring procedure. That's it for announcements. And now I'll turn it over to Rizgar for opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Rizgar Ghazi, and I am the Deputy Director for the Hazardous Waste Management Program at DTSC. I want to welcome you to today's listening session on the violation scoring procedures, also known as a VSP. As Asha mentioned, today's presentations, there's two presentations, one by Ryan Maya on give you some primer on the VSP regulation itself and how it's applied at DTSC for the last 3 years, and with Gary Hammond coming right after him to talk about some considerations we want to make for changes to the regulation, to the existing regulations. So these considerations are the changes what I'm going to propose. It was based on feedback from our stakeholders, the way our team, VSP team, that when implementing the regulations, and from our permitting staff, looking at the regulations and how it could be implemented. We also got some feedback from the Office of the Appeals Official based on their decisions they've made on several of these VSP scores. So this accumulation of feedback we got from several different areas, and we'd like to share those with you today and get your feedback on it. We're excited about, as you know, this has been implemented for the last 3 years. There's some definitely, it's a new way of looking at facilities and holding DTS accountable if the facilities requires DTS to take action against these facilities. And again, the intent here is to be transparent, and so everybody knows what the score for that facility and how their compliance history looks like. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Asha to introduce the other two speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you for the opening remarks, Rizgar. Now I'd like to turn it over to Ryan Mia for our first presentation.
Thank you, Asha. As we said before, my name is Ryan Mia. I'm a senior scientist in DTSC's Hazardous Waste Management Program. I've been involved with the VSP scoring process since the start of implementation in 2019, and I'm honored to be here to participate in today's discussion and look forward to the feedback that you'll be providing. But before that, I'd like to briefly go through a general description of the VSP process as currently implemented. Slide 7, please. Next slide. All right, so Senate Bill 673 in 2015 directed the department to adopt regulations to establish or revise the standard used for determining issuance of a hazardous waste facility permit. The regulations were then subsequently crafted to create the violation scoring procedure, or VSP for short. Slide 8, please. So here are the brief overview of some of the goals of the VSP program that we established. We wanted and needed the implementation process to be consistent and transparent, a systematic process for assessing a facility's compliance history, and it's a tool that supports permit decisions. Next, we'll move to a brief description of what a facility VSP score is, which is presented on slide 9. So what is a facility VSP score? It's a score that's calculated for every operating hazardous waste facility in California that currently holds a DTSC permit. There's about 78 currently permitted DTSC facilities statewide right now. It's a score that's updated on an annual basis. And so implementation of the VSP regulations improves public transparency because it requires posting of these facility VSP scores and their compliance tier assignments on an annual basis. And then, as I said before, it's an additional tool to better support the permit decision-making process. It's not the only criteria that DTSC uses to evaluate a facility's suitability for permit renewal, approval, or denial. Next slide, slide 10, please. Now I'll briefly touch upon the definition of an inspection as described in the VSP regulations and discuss some examples of inspection types. And so in the VSP regulations, the compliance inspection means an evaluation of a hazardous waste facility's compliance with any operating hazardous waste management requirements. It includes, but it's not limited to, scheduled and unscheduled inspections by the department and may last more than one day. This slide presents examples of some of the specific types of inspections that DTSC conducts on a regular basis that were evaluated for the VSP scores. So the first one is a compliance evaluation inspection and a financial records review. A compliance evaluation inspection, or CEI, evaluates a facility's compliance with the applicable hazardous waste management requirements and conditions established in the facility's DTSC permit. As part of a CEI, inspectors are often required to request assistance from our financial responsibility unit to request a financial records review to ensure that the permitted facility has the required funds in place and documentation in case there's a spill or a facility closes. And if a spill happens, the facility decides to close, it ensures that there are funds in place to cover those costs. Because the financial records review is initiated by the compliance evaluation inspection, any violations discovered from the associated financial records review are included as a part of the CEI. The second item is a groundwater audit inspection, or sometimes called a GAR. Periodically at facilities, there might be groundwater monitoring wells that are required to be sampled at a certain frequency and maintained. And a groundwater audit inspection, what that does is it inspects those wells associated with the sampling events to make sure that the facility is sampling them correctly and with the required frequency, and the wells are inspected and repaired so that we can trust the data that's gathered from them in a timely manner. Another example of a type of inspection is a focused compliance inspection. And those can occur if a facility has had a history of issues and or non-compliance with a specific permitted unit, for example, or sometimes if closure of one of the permitted units takes place, there's an FCI that takes place to ensure that closure occurs in compliance with DTSC approved closure plans and regulatory requirements. And then finally, complaint inspections result from complaints received that warrant inspection to kind of verify and or document potential non-compliance issues. So we'll move to the next slide, where I'll talk about a general overview of the VSP process. So the VSP process begins with an inspection, and an inspection violation score is calculated, followed by a facility VSP score. And then based on that score, a compliance tier is assigned accordingly. So a DTSC inspection takes place, and each class 1 violation is cited and is assigned a score based on a couple criteria. One of them is potential impacts to human health and the environment. Another is how far the violation deviates from the requirements, and then also whether or not it's a repeat class 1 violation that was cited previously by DTSC. And each of those individual violation scores are then put together for a given inspection in order to create an inspection violation score for that inspection. So that's that first category on the left. And then the last 10 years of inspection violation scores are added together and divided by the total number of inspections conducted during those 10 years to create the facility VSP score. That's the middle category here in the slide. And then based on the facility VSP score that's calculated, a compliance tier is assigned. So a facility VSP score that's less than 20 results in an acceptable compliance tier assignment. A facility VSP score of 20 or greater, but less than 40 results in the conditionally acceptable compliance tier assignment. And then a facility VSP score of 40 or greater results in an unacceptable compliance tier assignment. Facilities with conditionally acceptable and unacceptable compliance tier assignments require additional actions to be taken that I'll discuss very briefly in a moment. So we can move to the, and then also the facility may challenge the inspection, any inspection violation scores, the facility VSP score, as well as the unacceptable compliance tier. So here's a distribution of the compliance tier assignments for the 2020 facility VSP scores, where facilities landed and their compliance tiers assigned. So we had 64 facilities that landed in the acceptable compliance tier, 11 in the conditionally acceptable compliance tier, and then 3 in the unacceptable compliance tier. And so now I'm going to describe more specifically what these compliance tier assignment categories mean for a facility moving forward. So next slide, please. So for an acceptable compliance tier, there's really no additional requirements that are necessary. A facility has no permitting consequences that result from the VSP score. And so, and then there's also occasions where some facilities have a 0 score. And what that means is that the facility was not cited for a class 1 hazardous waste violation in the past 10 years. But however, the facility could have been cited for class 2 violations or minor violations or other violations by other regulatory agencies. So we just wanted to explain a little bit more what a 0 score means. So the next slide is about the conditionally acceptable compliance tier assignments requirements. Slide 14, please. So in the conditionally acceptable compliance tier, a facility is required to prepare third-party audits conducted by auditors and reviewed and approved by DTSC. And so the audits take place and the facility submits audit reports, and then there's a compliance implementation plan that's submitted with each report, and then the actions that are required include that the facility must comply with the actions needed to correct the findings of some of the audit reports, and then DTSC may impose additional permit requirements. And these permit requirements may include things like restrictions, enhancements, or mitigation measures, or even prohibitions on some of the hazardous waste management activities. Finally, then we'll move to the unacceptable compliance tier requirements, which are summarized on the next slide, slide 15. And so for the unacceptable compliance tier assigned facilities, DTSC is required to initiate the process to deny, suspend, revoke, or modify the permit for that facility. And then, as I said before, the facility can challenge an unacceptable compliance tier. And in such a case, a public meeting will take place during a challenge, and DTSC will issue a decision on their tier assignment. And then with respect to the permit decision, if the tier stands, DTSC continues down the path of permit denial, suspension, or revocation. And then there's occasions also where finding out of overriding considerations, the DTSC could still issue the permit with restrictions. So they can still actually have a permit assigned in an unacceptable compliance tier, but in such a case, there would likely be special permit conditions that are initiated or required. And some of those things could be like a 5-year limit on the permit instead of like typically 10 years, enhanced compliance requirements and facility specific mitigation measures, for example. And so that's a very, very general overview of the VSP scoring process as it's been currently implemented. And I want to thank you again for your time and attention. And so now I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Mr. Gary Hammond, to describe some of the VSP regulation changes that are currently being considered. Slide 16, please.
Hello, my name is Gary Hammond. I'm a hazardous substances engineer in the hazardous waste management program at DTSC. I'm going to be talking about the various violation scoring procedure regulations that DTSC is considering for changes. The reasons for the changes include clarifications to reduce legal challenges, clarifications to address situations that have occurred which were not addressed in the original regulation, and changes for lessons learned to make the process more effective. At the end of my presentation, we will take questions and comments about the changes under consideration. We've been able to classify the suggested changes into 4 categories. The scoring number of years to be considered describes the number of years of inspection scores that shall be used for tier assignment. The scoring frequency in tier assignment describes the frequency at which violation scores will be calculated and issued along with the associated tier assignment. The scoring divisor provides a standardization of comparing scores for facilities that are frequently inspected compared to facilities that are inspected less frequently. And the other changes describe other minor changes that don't fall into the above categories. The current VSP tier assignment uses 10 years of inspection scores for the evaluation and tier assignment. Some people maintain that recent violations should be weighted more heavily, or that, especially after an ownership change, the scoring should be reset, as new ownership should not be credited or punished for the past actions of the previous ownership. Including only 3 years of enforcement inspections would provide that the current operations of the facility would be reflective of the current regulatory compliance. Inclusion of 5 years would also provide a similar picture of recent compliance. Another alternative under consideration is to use 10 years, but if ownership changes, score only new ownership. This would allow new ownership to not be punished or credited for the previous owner's performance history. Current regulations specify that VSP scores will be calculated annually, and scores and tier assignments are finalized if not disputed or upon dispute resolution, official written decisions. Some suggestions that DTSC is considering are calculating the scores every 2 years or longer instead of annually, as permits are renewed every 10 years. Finalize and assign the tier only after all disputes are finalized, including legal challenges and cases. If the tier doesn't change from the previous year, the requirements of that tier must be completed again. And another change under consideration is that the tier is reduced from a previous year. Any incomplete requirements for the higher tier must still be completed. Current regulations require that the VSP tier assignment be calculated by dividing the sum of 10 years of violation scores by the number of inspections during that 10-year period. The scores considers 10 years of history, but divides the total score by the number of inspections to normalize facilities that are inspected more often than others. Some considerations include assigning the tier with no divisor, meaning the sum of all the inspection scores for the facility for 10 years would be used for tier assignment. In this case, a facility inspected less frequently would almost certainly have a lower score. Another consideration is using 5 years of inspection scores and then dividing by the total number of inspections in those 5 years. Some have suggested considering 10 years of scores, but weighting the recent scores more heavily. This would help to provide a better measure of recent compliance. There are several miscellaneous changes that have been suggested and that are under review. The current regulations do not clearly include all the compliance inspection types that can be used in compliance scoring, and does not specify that several types of inspections can be conducted and documented in a single inspection. DTSC is considering adding clarification that facilities' self-disclosure inspections, compliance assistant visits, and inspections from an agency that was not referred to the department are not to be considered in VSP scores for facilities. Current regulations do not clearly exclude transportation violations, and currently the regulations do not provide a method of scoring a new facility. The regulations may be revised to require only one contractor for DTSC's considerations when a facility is in the conditionally acceptable tier. And other minor changes include cross-reference corrections and due date clarifications. So our next steps for the regulation changes include the following. DTSC is planning to revise the regulations in the fall of 2021. A public comment period on the proposed changes will be held in the spring of 2022 as required by the rulemaking process. And DTSC plans to submit the revised regulations to the Office of Administrative Law for acceptance and implementation in the summer of 2022. The schedule is subject to change based on feedback received during this meeting and the public comment period for the rulemaking process. We've presented a brief overview of the violation scoring procedure and then presented some changes that DTSC is considering. My contact information is also listed here. Please feel free to contact me with any additional questions or comments that you may have. I will turn the time back over to Asha to facilitate the question, answer, and comment session. We want to hear your comments on the changes we are considering. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for the presentation, Gary. Now I'd like to switch over to the listening session where you can provide us with your comments and questions. So we did receive a number of questions from Mariah. So I'll go ahead and read each of the questions out and we'll get a response. So the first question is there a method for a third party, such as citizens, to challenge a facility being classified as acceptable? If not, is this something DTSC would consider integrating? So I understand that Rizgar would like to respond.
Yes, thank you, Asha. And Mariah, thank you for that question. I definitely would like to hear your feedback. And actually, I'm going to turn it around and ask you that question if possible. Asha, is there a way you could put Mariah online so that I could follow up on a question I had? So we're not opposed to having a public comment on their scores. However, it wasn't clear what part of the process you'd like to have that input.
Yeah, so my understanding is that once the score is sort of provisionally assigned, the facility has, I think you said 60 days or a certain period of time in which they can appeal that scoring decision, but only if it is, I believe it was only if it's unacceptable, that conditionally acceptable and acceptable cannot be appealed. So the sort of flip side of that is whether or not if a facility is classified as conditionally acceptable or as acceptable, is there a way for citizens to, within the same timeline, challenge that? And it kind of ties into a question that I have for a little bit later, or maybe now, which is if things like the dispute resolution process can result in something that was previously considered a violation to be reclassified as either below a class 1 violation and therefore not counted towards the score, or revoked entirely. Because as an example, I can imagine a process in which a DTSC were to issue a class 1 violation, and then as a result of the dispute resolution process, declassify it as a class 1, and then it wouldn't impact their score and would allow them to maintain an acceptable score, and that residents or citizens or involved groups would want to contest that. By contesting the scoring as a acceptable score, if that makes sense.
Yes, Mariah, thank you for that clarification. So just to make sure we're clear here, all violations are, the facility can challenge all the violations, irrelevant it's in the acceptable, the score ends up being an acceptable score. They could challenge each of these violations when it's scored. So that's an opportunity for the facility to challenge that. So it really doesn't matter what tier they're in. The question, I think, more importantly, you asked whether can the citizen contest these scores based on the violations. That's something definitely we'll take it back and consider that part of the regulations.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the response. We'll move to the second Q&A. Why are federal facilities exempt from using a third-party auditor and allowed to self-report and self-audit? I understand you want to respond to that one, Rizgar?
Yes, thank you, Asha. Brian, that's a good question again. Federal facilities are typically large facilities, and they have multiple programs within the military bases. So our thought is and again, the challenges with contracting with outside entities, that's a lengthy process that the military has to go through. And we wanted to have these audits implemented as quickly as we can. And the military bases typically have the ability to do these audits internally from different groups within within the base. So that's why the intent was here so that military could move quickly doing the audit. However, a different entity within the military does this audit for them, not specifically that particular group that runs the hazardous waste facility.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next Q&A. This has got a couple of questions in it. What is DTSC's justification for allowing a permit to be issued when a facility is in the unacceptable category, when that category is supposed to lead to DTSC potentially revoking the permit? If the facility has shown that it won't comply with the law, why does DTSC believe that they will comply with additional permit conditions?
Thank you for that question again. DTSC will not revoke a permit or not issue a permit till the process has gone through the process. So there's a dispute. We want to hear the dispute official take that dispute and process that. Once that facility's tier assignment comes up, according to the regulation, the facility again could petition the department to look at their tier assignment. And at that time, whether if they're in their tier changes to conditionally acceptable, at that time, DTSC will make consideration for issuing a permit for that facility. However, the tier assignment doesn't change. They continue to be in the unacceptable. DTSC will move forward with revoking the permit for the facility. So it's not a done deal that will issue a permit irrelevant of the VSP score. That's that may be misunderstood here.
I add to that a little bit as well, Rizgar.
Sure. Thank you.
Mariah, thank you so much. That is an awesome question, and it's something that I really appreciate. But I did want to, again, I think this speaks a little bit to what I mentioned earlier, that this is just one of many tools. There's a lot of other criteria that are also evaluated as a part of evaluating whether or not a facility is suitable for a permit. And so there's other considerations that that are brought to the table when they're renewing the permit. But I do appreciate the perspective that you've provided here, because it's true. It's difficult sometimes to expect them to be in compliance after additional restrictions are made to them if they have demonstrated a lack of compliance previously. But yeah, there are additional criteria that are evaluated. So thank you so much. I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Thank you, Ryan. Mariah, I guess I'm going to add something else to the topic here. Again, the dispute process and potentially the litigation for these disputes may take a long period of time. And DTSC always wants to make sure these facilities operate in a safe and protective manner. So there's a possibility DTSC may want to issue to this facility in the interim with conditions to make it very clear to the facility how they need to operate, and to assist our enforcement in enforcing the permit. And that's why DTSC may issue a permit to ensure the facility is held accountable during that period of time as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'll take this last one for Mariah, and then we'll go to a raised hand. Why wait until after the dispute resolution process to finish before counting the violation for scoring? Is it possible for the dispute resolution process to result in a violation being reclassified as a lower class violation? Is it possible for dispute resolution to result in revocation of a violation?
Yeah, this is Rizgar again. We want to make sure the facility has the capability of challenging the department for the violations before we making these scores final. So what we issue is a provisional score. And during that period, the facility has the ability to challenge that score through an appeal process. Then once that process is completed, DTSC will publish a final score. That's the intent here.
Also, too, if I can clarify, the violation for VSP purposes, the violation, even if it's challenged, it's not really removed. It's just not scored for VSP purposes on occasion if the challenge is successful. But a reason for waiting is because you're right, the score does periodically change as a result of the challenge that is submitted and provided to the department based on maybe some information that's provided in response to that. But there are occasions where it changes. So then that's why the consideration for maybe waiting for it to be final after the dispute resolution process takes its course is is part of the consideration. So thank you again, Mariah. I hope that we answered your questions accordingly.
Great, thank you. Let's see, Angela, do you have a question for us? I saw your hand raised.
Yeah, I had questions and then I was typing them in the chat box, so I'm happy to do it either way. So I would appreciate it if you could talk a little bit more about how the statement, what you consider when you're making the statement of overriding considerations for facilities that are found to be unacceptable.
Thank you for the question. Who would like to take that?
I'll take that question. Hi, Angela. Thank you for that question. So again, this is it's specified in the regulations. Once the facility, part of the tiering assignment, the meaning for that, the facility, based on the regulation requirements, needs to demonstrate to the department why they need to, why DTSC should consider changing their tier from unacceptable to a conditionally acceptable tier. And those are the consideration that we'll make during that.
So I'm sorry, I asked my question poorly. That was not the kind of answer that I was expecting. So can I give it one more go?
Absolutely.
And so I think that what the regulations say is that DTSC can still give a facility a permit, even if it's found to be unacceptable, but before it does so, it would make some statement of overriding considerations that in which it finds that, you know, there's an important need for this facility to continue to operate despite its past lawless behavior. And so I'm trying to understand how DTSC, what DTSC takes into account and how it makes this determination that there are, you know, some overriding reasons why this facility should be allowed to continue to operate despite its unacceptable compliance tier score.
Angela, thank you for that clarification. Yes. So once the way the process goes, once we have the tiering assignment, if the facility continues to be in the unacceptable tier, or requires the department to go through the revocation of their permit or permit denial, at that time the facility could make a request the department consideration. This is a request of the director to consider why we should not deny the permit, issue a permit. Those considerations are very limited in scope, such as national security, provides essential needed services to the state of California. So they're very limited in scope and for that consideration, and those considerations are given to the director to make.
Is there a list of those considerations? Because I don't see them here in the regulations.
They're not. So I gave you two examples of those. Again, not knowing because it's project specific, site specific, and that's something the department will consider, the director will consider once they approach that phase of the process.
Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. We'll move on to the next Q&A. Let's see. The VSB is only applicable to hazardous waste facilities, in parentheses it says TSDF, or the hazardous waste generators as well?
I mean, I can take that. This is Ryan. Yeah, the VSP scores themselves are only for the permitted hazardous waste facilities that DTSC has permits for. So yeah, primarily TSDFs, and the generators are many of them are regulated by different entities like the CUPAs, but the main purpose of the VSP scores are for facilities that have permits with DTSC, and those are usually treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, as you mentioned.
We have a hand raised. Cynthia, go ahead and ask your question.
I was doing kind of a follow-up to the answer that Angela was given. And so I'm concerned about facilities like the Exide facility. And so if they would have had a permit, would they have been allowed to continue because there are so few battery recycling facilities? And does that mean that the only existing Quemetco facility, if it was not scoring acceptably, and couldn't seem to come into compliance, would that be an example of a facility that would have these overriding considerations? And so I'd like to hear that. And if so, that's wrong.
Cynthia, that's a really good question. Again, this is site specific, project specific, and definitely the director will weigh based on feedback from our staff on whether the consideration that the facility is pushing forward is beneficial to the state before we make that decision. That's something, and projecting forward for other facilities at this time is not appropriate for us to make. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'll move over to another Q&A here. How are off-site transportation violations tracked, confirmed?
Right. So typically what happens is a particular facility, they have hazardous waste manifests that document where hazardous waste goes after it's generated or at the facility, stored at the facility. And then as a part of our inspections, we make sure that those materials are transported in a timely manner, as well as to TSD, treatment, storage, and disposal facilities that are allowed to accept those wastes. But it's basically done by a manifest search to document where it's ended up and the timeframes and the amounts that have been tracked from the facility to the ultimate TSDF locations. And but those are that's how we kind of track transporter violations and transportation violations.
But transporter violations are not included in the VSP scoring because they're off-site and often not related to the facility itself.
All right, thank you. And I'll take one more Q&A here. What is problematic with the current process for the scoring divisor? It is not clear what isn't working about the current process.
I'll take that question. Thank you for the question. Again, what we have in the current regulations, we take the number of inspections and divide it by the number of inspections that occurs within the 10-year period. That provides a score, and that's the methodology that we use for publishing our scores. There are some feedback that we received on this methodology, and what Gary presented today is different ways of looking at the facility score by potentially removing the divisor, so that we just add up all the violations and come up with a score and make a decision and align those scores with a tiering assignment. Again, this is the feedback that we'd like from you. If you think that the current regulations is acceptable, it should continue with that. We'd like to hear your feedback. However, if you think there's a different methodology of scoring these facilities, that's the feedback we'd like. There isn't a one way of doing this. There's multiple ways of doing it. And what currently we have is using the divisor for a period of 10 years. But again, there's a feedback that we received from to remove the divisor. So we have way presented as different methodologies of scoring the facilities now. Thank you.
Am I able to jump in? This is my question. It's Mariah.
Sure.
Hi, thanks. So you said that you received some feedback about the current process for the scoring divisor. Can you share what the feedback was that is leading people to question whether there might be another way to do it?
Sure. So the feedback is they believe that presenting the score, just the outright the score, the violations, scoring the violations and adding those up, that's a good representation of the facility score without the divisor. Again, some facilities, the feedback we got, some facilities get inspected more often than others. However, these facilities that get inspected more often because of their largeness or because of their continued lack of being in compliance. So we visit these facilities more often, so the scores adds up quickly. The current procedure is to divide that by the number of inspections we do to give it to standardize the score. But the feedback is that we should just remove that and just add the score based on the number of violations we find at the facility. Again, the expectation of these facilities to be in compliance, so they should not have a high score to start with. But again, if they do have a high score, you should just add those up.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I'll take another Q&A and then we'll move to a caller. The next Q&A is, I thought I saw higher weighting for facilities in areas identified as environmental justice areas. That did not come up in the presentation.
Yes, please. So give us that feedback if you think that we should consider higher scores for, again, this is a more of a listening session. We have some ideas. We want to make changes. If there's additional changes you'd like us to bring these regulations, we'd definitely like to hear from you and how should we use those scores in environmental justice communities. Thank you for that. I want to add one more. So in the cumulative impact and community vulnerability, we have looked at that piece of the comment you just made in that set of regulations. But again, if there's a belief that we should bring it into this set of regulations, I would like to hear from you. We'd like to hear from you. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, Rizgar, that Avilia is working on the Track 2 project that weighs that heavily and brings that into the regulations quite heavily.
Great, thank you. We'll move to another caller next. Michael, you can go ahead.
Hi. One of the things that the VSP program presumes is that the auditor program can be executed consistently from one facility to another. And with that in mind, with different inspectors, what is the auditor training program within DTSC? And is those materials available for the public to review so that we can ensure that they're being applied consistently from one facility to another? One example of that is a grouping of findings, whereas one auditor may identify 3 similar items as 3 findings, another may group them as one finding with 3 instances. And it's unclear what guidance the individual inspectors are being given, and it would help if the regulated community has access to that information.
Michael, thank you for that question. The intent for the department is to get third-party auditors. It's not going to be a function of DTSC to do these audits. And the requirement is for the facilities to provide a list of 3 auditors, firms to come in and provide those list of auditors to the department for us to select an auditor for the facility to do the audit. The intent was not for DTSC to do these audits. This is a third party coming in, looking at it, and to ensure the facility, especially in the areas that we have identified in the VSP or the violations, in those areas that we're going to focus on to ensure that the facility does come to compliance. It's more having boots on the ground versus us coming in there once a year. So this is an auditor company that come in, works with the facility to make sure they fix these violations and continues to be in compliance with these violations.
Great, thank you. We'll move to a couple of Q&As next. So the first one here is from Regina. What are the approval parameters for the third-party auditors? Additionally, may the public challenge the auditor's review?
The intent is for the department to review their resume and their experience and their capability. Again, there is no list of criteria that we use for acceptance of an auditor. Again, want to make sure this is a third party that's not related to the facility to do this audit. Currently, the regulation does not have the public give us feedback whether that particular auditor should be selected. But if that's something that I would like to hear from you, how could that be implemented? Thank you.
May I add to that question in response to your comment? So a previous person had asked, how we get that consistency or conformity amongst the auditors. Is there an intention to sort of have a profile or some mechanism to enhance the ability for some continuity from one facility to the next, or even from quarter to quarter with the same facility?
That's a good question, Regina. Again, definitely we want to have an auditing firm that is capable and has experience in this field. And again, we don't want to limit it to a certain entity to do this for us. Again, we want to leave it to the industry-wide to come up with these auditing groups to come in to help us out with the auditing of the facility. Again, we don't want to rely on one entity, and we want to make sure there's an adequate number of these entities out there so that we could select them as needed.
Regina, I think that's an excellent point, and one that is a comment that we can consider for sure. I think that's awesome. That's an awesome idea.
Yeah, and yes, please, if you give those feedback in writing, we're recording everything in this meeting as well. So if you have ideas how we could go about it, that would be great to hear from you.
Thank you. I'll take the next Q&A from Matthew. You mentioned that for the 10-year inspection scoring option, you thought that the facilities that had a skipped inspection year would score lower. Could you discuss that premise? Is it possible that those skips would result in higher violation counts on the next inspection?
I can address that. So this is Ryan. It depends on how they would be doing on their latest inspection. If an inspection didn't occur on a given year, it could be that 10 years ago there was an inspection that occurred that they had a number of violations. But if the next year comes about and that inspection gets bumped off of the facility score for the following year, then it has the potential to go down. But if a more recent inspection did take place and it has a number of violations that were cited and scored, then it could go up. So a lot of it depends on, what it changes year to year, depend a lot on when the inspections were conducted and when violations were cited. Hopefully that answers your question.
I think I'll take a couple more Q&As and then I'll get to your raised hand, Angela. So the next one is from Robert. The changes look directionally positive, but why do the regulations and proposed revisions fail to consider the following SB 673 requirements: completion of health risk assessment, environmental justice scores, and even outside audits?
Asha, I'll take that question. Thank you. That's a really good question. As you recall, as you may know, SB 673 had 7 elements of it, and the 2019 regulation that included the VSP had 5 elements in it, including the risk assessment and other requirements for facilities. VSP was focused specifically in the bill, and the SB 673 bill requires to score these facilities based on the violation. This is the piece of the regulations that we're focused on. There are other pieces of the regulation that addresses other factors of facility operation, including risk assessments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rizgar. Okay, I'll take another Q&A. This is from Christina. In the proposed regulations, it seemed that one VSP change proposed is heavier weighting of the Class 1 violations for facilities in areas identified as environmental justice areas. Is this still the case?
I think we answered this question before. Again, this is under consideration by these regulations, and would like to hear your feedback on it.
Okay, next let's take our caller. Angela, you can go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I actually still have a question and a comment, and so I'm happy to just ask the question and then get back into the queue to get the comment. So I'd like to ask a question about the scoring divisor proposed change. And as many of folks at DTSC knows, we have been sounding the alarm about the use of this divisor mechanism because it results in facilities that gets lots of inspections because they have a history of poor past behavior, ending up having very low VSP scores. So the division functions as a way to water down a VSP score, and that is deeply problematic. And by looking at the information that's come out over the past couple of years, what we've seen is that once a facility starts to have more than 10 inspections, it is very likely that they will not be an unacceptable category because of this division issue. So it's a very important question. And I'm looking at the what you're offering up here as solutions for this problem. And I'd like to understand more what you think changes if you switch from dividing by 10 years to dividing by 5 years. Also, what do you think changes if you weight this divisor, however that ends up happening? What do you think are the why do you think that changes the fundamental question about whether or not facilities are let off the hook because they have a lot of inspections?
Angela, thank you for that question. The intent was here to lay out some ideas and comments that we got on how we should address this. Same question you brought up is facility continues to be in non-compliance mode, and what historically done, we inspect these facilities more and to make sure they are aware that we're there to keep an eye on them. And that does, as you said, that does may water down the score and for the facilities. So we would look at 10-year period, and we looked at the 5-year period as proposed and 3-year period. Typically, what we want to do is focus on put more of our energy onto the more recent years, and that's one of the proposal that we had laid out in today's presentation is whether does it make a difference. And of course, we're doing the number crunching in the background for the 10-year, just adding the scores, looking at versus the 5 years, looking at 3 years, and looking at these facilities that violators, continuous violators, and how that impacts the scores for these facilities. So we're looking at multiple ways of answering that question that you had posed to us. It's not intended that's the direction we're going to go. We just wanted to look at what that looks like.
Well, if the purpose of the VSP is to identify those facilities that are operating in ways that are lawless, as indicated by their inspections surfacing these class 1 violations, right? The worst possible violations. So you've already not taken into account what is considered to be more, quote, minor violations. You've already focused on things that are the most impactful to human health and the environment. And these are the facilities that over the years are having, have sufficient violations that inspection score starts to get really high. And so I guess my question is, this notion about normalizing and this notion about dividing, and this notion that you are crunching the numbers in the background to see what it means if you divide by one number or a different number. It's why do you think that doesn't take us away from the goal of this, which is to identify those facilities that are consistent non-compliers and have their failure to comply consistently have an impact on their permitting decision? So why do you think that these other changes helps us as we're trying to understand how facilities are acting and what their compliance levels are?
So I can address that a little bit. I think that if we change the frequency to maybe a shorter period of time, it'll give is the potential, if that change were to be implemented, that it puts more emphasis on the more recent inspections, more weight to the more recent inspections. Right. So if right now it's 10 years, but if we did it for 5 years, what would that do? It would eliminate the inspections that occurred 5+ years ago and only focus on the more recent inspections. So it'd be a more recent evaluation of their compliance history. That's just one of the ways that it falls out in that evaluation. That's the reason why the thought was to maybe change that, or to evaluate whether or not that could be changed to really focus on maybe the more recent activities and the more recent violations. So I'm just throwing out there maybe parts of the reason why that might be part of the consideration. So
Angela, so don't get us wrong. We appreciate your comment. Definitely, we'll based on your feedback and feedback of others, we'll look at the best scenario to highlight the most egregious violators. That was the intent, and put them, and that's the intent of the SB 603 is to hold those people accountable. So that is our goal. And again, we appreciate that feedback you gave us.
I also had a comment that I wanted to make. Can I make it now, or should I wait?
Yeah, Angela, you had a couple in the Q&A. Go ahead and we'll take those right now. Thank you.
Okay, so I am wondering, I want to make a comment about the notion about the change in frequency generally, but also specifically about the notion of resetting the scores, as I understood the description, when you have an ownership change. I'm concerned that resetting at ownership changes could be deeply problematic for a couple of reasons. First, new owners, new corporation, is it actually a new owner? Is it a new corporate entity? You know, all the staffing changes, we see that happen all the time, right? There are new owners for facilities, but the underlying facility is actually still run by the same people. It could incentivize people to change ownership in order to reset bad VSP scores. I'm also concerned about it because the reality is, for the people who are living around that facility, the ownership doesn't matter that much. And so it's really about how these facilities are being operated and whether or not they are inherently dangerous. It's not clear that a new owner could come and clean it up. And I don't know why we would presume that based on ownership changes. And so to the extent that you're looking for feedback about some of the ideas that you're considering here, this notion about resetting the score when there is ownership changes feels deeply, deeply troubling to me. And then on the frequency question, I just wanted to note that the things that are being considered about frequency and how you change that, I just feel like we should ground what the frequency is in terms of the 3 versus 5 years, whatever those different increments are going to be. We should ground that in the kinds of protection that provides to the communities. I'm imagining that part of what DTSC is trying to balance here is your internal resources and what it takes to do this every year. And then when there are appeals, and then you have to go through the appeals process, it starts to be this never-ending. I could imagine y'all feeling like you're on a never-ending hamster wheel, which nobody wants to live like that, right? So if we're going to change the frequency to make it less than annual or make it less than 10 years, then we have to balance that with how do you make sure you're still getting the protections to the surrounding community that are intended by the VSP program. And so extending the period of getting relief to the community by waiting until all the appeals are decided, all that kind of stuff, it just feels like it incentivizes appeals from facilities, it incentivizes shenanigans in order to draw out that process, and then you have the new process, and then you start it all again. So I don't know that I don't know how to deal with this question, but it feels like a simple just switch of the number of years is not going to be adequate if we are sort of trying to make sure that communities that surround these facilities are getting what VSP is intending to provide.
Angela, those are very good comments. Thank you so much. Absolutely, we're not married to one way or another. I think as Ryan Maya mentioned, we want to focus on the current violation. We want to weigh those more. That's why we looked at 5 years and 3 years versus the 10 years. We're not set in either way, but again, given your feedback, and this is important, and we'd like to hear from all of you. What's your thoughts on that? And that's something, this whole purpose of this meeting. As for the DTSC ownership change, this is a comment from an anonymous attendee. So it's not clear that DTSC will reset the score for just because you change your name of the facility. That's, to me, that's not how it works. So again, we do the regulations laid out is based on the facilities right now, as currently stated, is past 10 years and irrelevant of the ownership status of the facility. I believe we lost Asha. So Gary, you want to run it from here?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jerry Dietrich, Public Participation Specialist for DTSC, and I will be picking up for Asha. Thank you so much for your patience. We're going to go ahead and go to the Q&A. We have a question from Marisol Aguilar. Will offsite transportation violations be included?
I believe we answered this question already. So offsite TSD facilities, the VSP score only applies to hazardous waste facilities on site, and offsite transport does not apply to them. Thank you.
Okay. And one from TJ McCostland. Why is it allowed for a facility tier to change without an inspection?
I'll answer that question. If facility 2 doesn't change, it's independent of inspection. The inspection is the inspection. Based on the score inspection, there's a tiering assignment. And from there, the facility could ask the department to change their tier based on their the public meeting and their presentation to the department. However, they're independent of each other.
Great, thank you. Next one from Robert Howard. How did DTSC come up with the 20 and 40 compliance tier threshold, and what are they based on? Since the program is so new, why did DTSC not develop a phase 1 for compliance tiers?
Yeah, Howard, thank you for that comment. Again, it's been a while since we came up with this scoring, but if you have a proposal how we should look at the tiering assignments, we'd love to hear it from you.
And one more, Byron Chan. If DTSC follows the timeline outlined in the PowerPoint presentation, when would facilities begin to receive a new score under the changed VSP?
Byron, thank you for that question. So again, depending when these regulations come and are set in place, once we have it, again, the current regulation requires to issue these scores in September. So if the score of the regulation comes through at that time, basically for that year, we probably would skip that year because we already published the scores for that year. So it'd be the following year. Again, we're open to hearing from you how that should be implemented as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So one from Andrea Ventura. Why are we actually dividing scoring by years or numbers of inspections when a single violation could have serious impacts on local communities or the environment? Why do they not stand on their own? And then I'm going to go ahead and open the audio for Andrea in case she has a follow-up question for you.
I'll take that one. Thank you. Andrea, I think in talking with Angela, we answered this question. Again, a single violation typically doesn't drive the score. It may drive the score to an acceptable tier. Again, that was the current regulation. We're not set up that way. This is the feedback that we'd like to hear from you, whether that should be the device should be removed, and that's what we're the point of discussion today as well. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I do want to follow up on that. Yeah, my advice is that, and this may sound naive, but I think part of the frustration people have sometimes with government is we make things more complicated than they need to be. Sometimes a violation is a violation, that is causing harm. It needs to be addressed immediately, and a company needs to be held accountable. I understand that we're looking at violations that need to be responded to right away. We're also trying to look at the history of a company or a facility that has, a history or a, kind of a serial non-compliance. And I think that if you're just listing their violations, that is going to become very clear very, very quickly. This dividing by how many times they're inspected seems to me to be just a complication and a really irrelevant situation. What's really relevant to the local communities that are being impacted by violations is what is happening at any given moment. And I don't think you really need to have a division and an equation to list multiple violations over time to see that there is an issue. So I guess, it's just, maybe I'm being naive, maybe I'm being simplistic, but I think that's part of the problem. I was rather shocked when I learned that this is how we do this to begin with, and would like you to consider that that is not necessary.
Andrea, thank you. Absolutely, that's part of the consideration and the purpose of this meeting today. I just want to remind you that we have other tools the department uses against these type of non-compliances. So it isn't just we're going to rely on the VSP score for us, the department to take action. We have denied permit facilities, not waiting for the VSP process to go through. We denied it based on other factors that we use to deny a permit. So if there's an egregious violations, definitely we have other tools to make to correct those violations immediately. So that's something that there's other parts of the statute that we could use to hold facilities accountable and to take action against them.
Next, we have the raise hand feature, Cynthia Babbage.
Yes. So this is a comment. I remember 10 years ago, the agency coming to EJ Communities when we first started talking about a scoring procedure. And our expectations were that this would lead to getting at bad actor facilities in our community and afford us more protections. And we reluctantly kind of went along with this process because we thought that the agency needed a way to systematically and diplomatically remove these bad actors. And then I saw a couple years ago, or maybe a little more recently, the scoring procedure being applied to a facility using it without the division, which would have created an unacceptable level, and then the division being applied to it by inspection. Division, I'm referring to dividing by the inspections, and that made it acceptable. And that's not what we're looking for, Rizgar. I'm not a lawyer, you know me, but as a person who's been impacted and fights very hard for my community and others, whatever method you need to get to remove these bad actors and bring some sense to the process, that's what we need you to do. We're relying on this VSP as we look at regulating hazardous waste sites in California. And if you have a flawed process, we're not ever going to get to a point where we transparently look at the issues facing California, and we have to make some hard decisions. And I guess what I'm saying is I'd like to be more hard decisions being made on facilities and not on my community and others. So I think people have said questions and comments beautifully and tactfully, but I'm just speaking from my heart. That's what my expectations are, and I hope that you can meet them.
Thank you, Cynthia. I appreciate your comments. Absolutely, we definitely want to hold these facilities accountable. And again, this is VSP is something new nationwide. This is the first of its kind, and we've learned from it. It's not perfect. Again, and again, we're looking at how we can bring improvements to these regulations. And the feedback you guys are giving us is important. And now, the more detailed feedback we get, it's better for us to turn that into regulations. Again, I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
We also have Marisol Aguilar with another question. She has her hand raised and there's a question in the Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and ask her to unmute herself and verbalize her question, please.
Hi. Yes. So my question, I guess there's a different one in the Q&A. And we can go through that one. But right now, what I want to ask that's harder to write in is about Class 1 violation scoring, just at that initial step when there's a Class 1 violation. So I know that, Class 1 violation can be, it says canceled, retracted, withdrawn, or successfully challenged. So my question is whether if a facility gets a Class 1 violation, and then they take steps to correct that violation, whether that then would be retracted and then not counted in the VSP.
I can take that. Thank you, Marisol. That's a wonderful question, and I appreciate it. If a violation is cited and a facility corrects it, that doesn't mean the violation goes away. They still actually had that violation, and it's still retained for VSP scoring purposes. Return to compliance doesn't remove the violation from the VSP scoring. It's an occasion where what that's referring to, the statement you're referring to, is more related to those violations that maybe the inspector goes back to the office and finds that that they actually did comply with this requirement and it was cited in error, or if there's other items that come to our attention later that warrant removal of it. So in essence, what I'm trying to say is that once a violation is cited, just because the facility returns to compliance doesn't mean that it goes away for VSP scoring purposes. So thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Marisol's question in the Q&A says, will there be set time limits to get through an appeal process?
Yes, this is Rizgar. Again, absolutely, the sooner we process an appeal, we could move forward with making a decision on the facility. Again, we are part of these VSP AB 158. We are looking for additional resources to help us with bringing additional resources to the VSP appeals office. It's an independent group from our enforcement group and permitting group. So we are again bringing additional resources to support that shop to process these appeals much faster.
Thank you. Question from Mariah Thompson. Has DTSC ever denied a request for overriding considerations?
Mariah, thank you for that question. No facility has gone through that process to date. Again, VSP is it's a new an implementation, and none of these facilities have reached that phase yet. Thank you.
One from Regina Colbert. To clarify an earlier question, VSP only applies to full TSDF permitted facilities. Tiered permits are not included?
That's correct.
Thank you. Michael Dudasco, is it DTSC inspector training that I was questioning and consistency? So I think he was asking about an answer you gave earlier, Rizgar.
I apologize, Michael. Could you rephrase your question? I'm not clear if what do you mean with DTSC inspector training in relation to the auditor? Could you?
Yeah, it's the DTSC inspectors coming out that end up getting a facility into the compliance tiers. And what we need to do is make sure that the DTSC is executing their roles, their inspectors are executing their roles consistently from one facility to another. And so what is their training, and is that training available for review by the public so we can see what they're being taught and make sure that they are executing their work properly.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, thank you for that clarification, Michael. I just want to say we definitely brought in a lot of improvements how we do our inspections and to bring in consistencies. For example, historically, we had one inspector visiting the site for multiple years, and their training was limited to these type of facilities. Now we're doing a lot of cross training for our inspectors so they have variety, and we double up on inspectors. So there's always a backup inspector, and they learn from each other. And more senior inspectors go with our more newer inspectors. But as a training program that we have our inspectors, I'm going to let Ryan speak about the inspector program that we have for all our inspectors.
Each of the new inspectors goes through basic inspector academy training, and there's also other trainings that enforcement inspectors go to, advanced environmental crime training and other things like that. But there's also additional opportunities, as Rizgar was saying, to go with more experienced inspectors as they're conducting their inspections as a backup. But yeah, there's definitely training that takes place. And then also, as we go through the enforcement process, there is a internal vetting that takes place with each of the violations as it relates to the enforcement of them. So there's a great deal of training and then on-the-job experience, as well as internal processes that allow it to go through management review a number of times. So that's in a nutshell what typically happens.
Thank you, Ryan. And Michael, again, each inspector has their annual mandatory trainings they need to go through. So there's all along, there's refresher trainings, lessons learned that we provide to our inspectors. So it isn't just they get one-time training and we leave them out there in the field. They do get multiple mandatory trainings. And as Ryan mentioned, an inspector is not relied upon by himself alone. Their supervisor reviews their work product and brought into a larger group to review these violations to make sure there's consistency throughout the department. There's a monthly meeting that we have a workshop before all our inspectors. So they bring in their cases to the team, more expert teams, and they run through these cases through them. So that is the consistency we use at the department.
Definitely, there's monthly enforcement forums that we have for statewide folks to bring questions and concerns, as well as exercises that we do on a monthly basis to sharpen some of the skills that we learned and to improve with consistency as well. So that's a part of what we do as well. Thank you.
I'm sorry to add on more. We definitely, we work closely with your CPA to get a national view how we do things. California is in the lead a lot of times in these areas. So however, we do consult with the other states and with your CPA to make sure we're consistent and in compliance with our RCRA authorization as well.
Yes, a portion of our enforcement is also there's an evaluation that takes place by USCPA as well of our enforcement programs. So these things are all part of the process to train as well as to maintain consistency throughout the state, if at all possible.
I do ask though, Michael, if there's an area that you'd like us to look into, would be more than happy to consider part of these regulations. I know this is part of the on VSP alone, but there's other areas part of the regulation that we're working on. Potentially, we could include this. So if there's areas that we could bring in improvements that we do on inspections, our enforcement program. Definitely would love to hear from you.
Thank you. So we have a question from an anonymous attendee. If outside auditors are used, will their fees be paid by DTSC or the TSDF?
That's a simple one. That'll be a fees paid by the facility.
Okay, thank you. One more from anonymous. We are hearing that DTSC wants to rely on outside auditors more in the future, which seems like a better allocation of resources. But is DTSC saying it will not consider outside audits today or until the regulations are revised?
Thank you for that question. So the regulations already exist requiring the facilities to bring in an outside auditor. So that's not something we're, unless we get comments to improve on the process we have in the current regulations. But currently there are requirements to bring in an outside auditor to look at these facilities.
Thank you. And over on the raised hand section, we're going to go ahead and ask Chuck White to unmute himself and verbalize his question, please.
Great, thank you very much. I really want to compliment the department for opening up this conversation. A lot of the suggested changes, you provide a range of suggested changes as put out by Mr. Hammond. I think those are appropriate questions to be raised, and we will look forward to commenting during this informal process, and I'm probably sure again during the formal process. I mean, examples of what I think are really good is respect to the 10-year window, particularly with respect to old violations that may have been resolved years ago satisfactorily, and they certainly should not be handled at the same level of concern that a more recent inspection has been, for example. And so I don't have any specific recommendations this time, but I appreciate you opening up the door to take a look at the fact, and I would certainly suggest that if you've got 10-year-old violations that were resolved within a very short period of time 10 years ago, they certainly should be viewed to a lesser degree than a more recent violation. Secondly, the scoring frequency, I think of adjustment to every 2 years or 5 years or any years, it makes sense. I think it would be a benefit to the workload definitely to VTSC and everybody else for that matter. Yet it would still provide a timely evaluation. And so I think that's a good idea. And certainly I would suggest that any enforcement action that is under appeal or is unresolved at the time the biennial or whatever scoring for frequency is done should not be included in the score. It should be resolved because I know people in industry make mistakes, but I know DTSC makes mistakes from time to time. We're all human. And so if there's a allegation of a violation that is resolved, that should not be counted against the facility. A couple of other things that I would ask you to consider. One is the severity of the Class 1 violation. Imminent and substantial endangerment has a wide range of possibilities, ranging from very remote potential of there being a harm to an actual release that may very well have caused a harm. And so I would certainly suggest that Class 1 violations ought to be evaluated through the lens of how much actual harm has occurred as a result of that violation. It may have been just a temporary violation that may have posed a potential harm for a short period of time, but that's totally different than something that would be much longer in duration that, and certainly if one that actually caused an actual harm. So I would certainly encourage the department to take a look at the severity of the class 1 violation with respect to is it actual or potential harm. Another issue that I know, and I used to work for the department many, many years ago, and one issue that has always been a struggle is the tension between permitting and enforcement. And I know that there are situations, I could probably cite several of them, where the particular facility has been permitted and inspected for a period of time, and certain existing operations were deemed to be totally in compliance. However, over a period of time, particularly through the permit review, a permit writer might say, well, I think maybe this thing is permitted in the wrong way and should have been looked at differently. And the facility may say, yeah, we may agree with that, but and we're certainly willing to have it revised in our permit. But as you well know, a permit decision takes 2, 3, 4, 5, even longer years to get through. In the meantime, if the enforcement people catch wind of this violation, if you will, violation that had been accepted to go on for many years, that seems to be a little bit unfair. And I think there ought to be some consideration given to whether the facility had this ongoing situation for a long period of time, presumably with the knowledge of DTSC inspectors and permitters, but some interpretation resulted in a change of how that particular situation is viewed. That ought to be taken into consideration during the scoring process. And finally, I know other people have raised this issue that, what about the need for a facility? And yet we hope all facilities operate in 100% compliance, and it's very seldom that's a case. I'm glad for those facilities that are able to do it. But the regulations, hazardous waste regulations, are very, very complicated in California, not least of which because California has its own set of differing regulations than those of US EPA, particularly in the area of recycling. And I think that needs to be taken under consideration, is that what is the need for a hazardous waste facility that is able to properly handle, properly recycle, and handle a waste in California? Right now, California, I believe, exports at least or thereabouts 50% of the hazardous waste that's generated. That's exported to other states and countries. And as Rizgar acknowledged, no other state or country has the same kind of violation scoring procedure. And most other states don't have the same kind of rigorous requirements and more stringent and restrictive requirements that exist in California law. I'm not arguing against that. All I'm just saying is that the department needs to take into consideration the need for a facility and whether or not there is adequate capacity in California to handle that particular hazardous waste. And if there isn't, that would certainly should be given some overriding consideration of the department making some kind of provision for the continuing ability of California to manage its hazardous wastes. And I would hope that that is certainly taken account in the system at some point in time, even though it's not clearly articulated in the regulations, that we certainly don't want to have hazardous waste that is being presumably reasonably well handled in California to be exported to another state or country where it's not even regulated at all as a hazardous waste, or may not be regulated to the same degree. So again, I just want to thank you for doing this opening session. I think it's helpful to everybody involved. I feel it was necessary to get up and give a little bit of perspective from the regulated industry in California, because I don't know of anybody that really wants to be in violation of the hazardous waste control laws. We want to be 100% compliance. It's like the situation of hoping to have 0 accidents at the workplace. We all hope that's the case. But unfortunately, accidents and mistakes do happen, and there needs to be recognition that there is, if there really is a nefarious intent behind the operation of a facility, certainly common sense should prevail, and that facility should not be allowed to operate. But if the facility is clearly doing everything they possibly can to comply with California's complex hazardous waste regulatory structure, somehow there needs to be due recognition of that fact. So thank you for the opportunity to comment, and we'll be certainly submitting comments to the department during this informal process and probably during the formal process as well.
Thank you for those comments, Chuck. Is there anybody that would like to respond to Chuck?
Yeah, this is Rizgar. Chuck, thank you for your comments. And again, these regulations is the intent of these regulations, the VSP regulations, to make things transparent and to hold the facility that are continue to be in violations accountable. It's not for a facility that does have a one class 1 violation and we shut them down. That is not intended of this. This is to require accountabilities for the facilities and to hold DTSC accountable to take action against facilities that continue to be in violations. He mentioned, made a lot of comments and appreciate those. One of the things that you mentioned that we should weigh the violations. And the VSP scoring does weigh these violations on what's called the extent of deviation, extent of harm of that particular violation. That's part of the scoring mechanism that we have in the regulations currently. If there's feedback on that, we definitely would like to hear from you. Again, this is the purpose of these regulations to make it transparent so the public knows the standing of these facilities and to hold DTSC accountable to take action against these facilities. And that's the intent of these regulations. We have other statutes and regulations that could take, we could take immediate action if there's imminent and substantial endangerment. We're not going to wait for this VSP scoring to go through the process before we take action against facilities. Again, they're intended to show the standings of these facilities and the public knows how they stand and requires DTSC to take action against these facilities that continue to be egregiously in an unacceptable score. Thank you.
Thanks, Rizgar. We have a couple more Q&As. And let's see, this next one is from Paul. He says, Mr. White's comments are spot on. I agree that more consideration has to be given to the types and risks associated with violations issued. And we'll take that as a comment. Rizgar, did you have a response?
No, again, I think I answered this question. Again, we definitely weigh each violation on its the extent of harm it provides and extent deviation from the law. So we do consider that already. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And our last Q&A is from Marisol, who's asking, is there a minimum facility inspection schedule?
I can address that. The hope, the goal is for us to get out to each of these facilities at least once every other year. It doesn't always happen, unfortunately, and we are held accountable to that by folks like US EPA. And sometimes we do have to go out there more frequently than that on some occasions based on some complaints and other things. But the goal is to get out there once every other year if possible.
And I just wanted to add, some larger facilities do get annual inspections, such as our landfills. Larger TSDF facility will get an annual inspection. Again, these facilities that are they're in violation, we will inspect them more frequently, even more than once a year. So
correct. Yeah. Certain facilities. Yeah, you're absolutely correct, Rizgar. I stand corrected, but I wanted to talk in more general terms. Yeah, thank you for the clarification.
Just so the program does lay out a schedule for all our facilities. Yeah, depending on the size of the facility, the type of facility we lay out a schedule, and there's various schedules for these type of facilities. Again, they vary and the frequency of these inspections. Thank you.
So I'm looking to see if we have any other Q&As, excuse me. I'm not seeing any other comments in the Q&A or any other questions. I don't see any hands raised. So I'd like to thank you all for your feedback this morning. Please do keep your comments coming to Gary through October 29th. You can email him at gary.hammond@dtsc.ca.gov, or you can call him at 916-323-2833. That concludes our listening session. And now I'd like to hand it over to Rizgar for closing remarks.
Thank you, Ash. Yes, thank you all for joining today's meeting. The intent of the meeting again is to get your feedback on the current regulations and what changes you would like to make these regulations. Again, thank you for your feedback. There are some areas that we definitely need to go back and rethink through how we could change these regulations. Again, as Asha said, please send all your comments to, if you have any comments, or call Gary and with your suggestion, and definitely will consider those part of the regulations. And I look forward to having our to start the pre-APA process for these regulations. And thank you all.
Thanks again, everyone. We look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for joining us this morning.